Years ago, when I was the strength and conditioning coach for the 76ers, I was a very early adopter of whole body vibration. And at that time, might have been looked upon as a resource, as somebody that, because I didn't spend $10,000 of the Sixers' money to buy a Vibraflex. If I didn't have any interest or understand what it was doing, et cetera, et cetera. I went on to work for the company a little bit after, but I knew things about whole body vibration that were science, et cetera. It was around the same time that Vibraflex had some very, very serious competition from PowerPlate, which I think still exists. And I would say PowerPlate is no value other than putting a foam roller on it. I think that feels really good. But to stand on it, the frequencies are not correct. Abercrombie and Amonette published literature that showed increased head acceleration. No, that doesn't automatically mean a concussion. What it does mean is that if you already had some head acceleration on Sunday and then you went and used the PowerPlate the next day, that could put you into frank concussive symptoms. But because you didn't have it on Sunday, you didn't get put into concussion protocol. Fact. I know people probably hate that, but most people hate facts when they are not what they currently believe. We saw that the frequencies that Bosco studied, so this is a real thing. The first time I ever knew of a good friend now, Marco Cardinale, who was Bosco's research assistant, graduate assistant, and they were studying whole body vibration, where we needed to be between 22 and 28 hertz to have this maximal contraction. And the whole idea of whole body vibration, it is one of the few ways, other than figuratively stepping onto a tack, that you could elicit a spinal reflex. And a spinal reflex has value because it is very, very fast. It happens in 30 to 50 milliseconds. That is what a whole body vibration would elicit. Now, I could get into more of the differences between Vibraflex, which was patented, so it was the only one that could do what it did, versus PowerPlate, which would lie and claim that it would be triplanar, but it would all vector into vertical because it was 70% vertical. So the fact that it's vertical, just say it's three planes because it moves in three planes, but it didn't matter because it would all vector into vertical. It wouldn't perform any differently than a Nemes, or there was a big giant one that was, people were putting barbell, like a bench on to, the whole thing was wild when whole body vibration was I'm hesitant to say a fad. It's just very difficult to justify those kinds of dollars. And I look back, it's like, can this thing do something that nothing else can do? Okay, let's look at it. But looking back, I'd probably rather spend $10,000 on a lot of other things. The value, though, of 30 to 50 milliseconds, several years later, I started to look at, I don't remember the title of the textbook, but the reason I found it was because it was the actual research, and it was like a big ass school textbook, that the chapter was written by Gray Cook and Mike Voigt. So my bias led me to find this textbook that I still have. And in that chapter, it was the research for RNT, reactive neuromuscular training. It was the real science that would explain why putting a band around your knee or around your waist and feeding the mistake and etc., why these things would work just by this potential shift in center of gravity or exaggerating the mistake, etc. Part of that chapter would explain that the reaction, the speed of how an RNT would elicit a muscular response was roughly 50 to 80 milliseconds. So that should kind of be interesting, that 30 to 50 was the spinal reflex, 50 to 80 was this reactive type, like if I push you and you react, that's a little bit slower, but not nearly as slow as a volitional contraction, which could be anywhere from 80 to 120 or longer milliseconds. So this is lots of fancy numbers, etc. But clearly, those are three different ways that we contract muscle, and they all have different times. They actually have names, and you'll find it in that chapter, where 30 to 50 is called an M1 reflex or an M1 response. M2 is that reactive component, that 50 to 80 milliseconds, and M3 is the slowest, the volitional response. So for me to do this, that takes 80 to 120 milliseconds for that signal to get there and then elicit a response. So why is all that important? Well, does it matter? Are we in an environment where training one of those responses is of value? Well, I don't know, and I have never at that time, and I'm not super well trained anymore in whole body vibration, but the facts don't necessarily change. The relevance of the facts or the surrounding bits of information may change. I don't know that you can train the spinal reflex. I don't know that you can get better at that. That's kind of like what comes downloaded with the OS, and it's what it is. It's an extremely valuable protective response that is probably, there's a reason that we can't get faster at it. You can't get better at it. Your brain is not not involved in that analysis of the signal and eliciting a response. So why is these things important? Well, we've talked about this a lot when I was in China. I've talked about this in other ways, and I don't know the gentleman's name, but I want to say he's either at Clemson or Auburn, and he talks about ACL rehab or ACL prevention in terms of a sensory motor component, and there's a good reason, because the research would tell us that when given a level of stimulus that would exceed the connective tissue capacity of an ACL, it can take as little as 35 milliseconds to tear the ACL. So where does that land? That lands in that 30 to 50. So basically, we need to figure out other ways. The dude's name's Jason something. I really enjoy reading his Twitter stuff. I'd love to connect more, because this is something that like the whole body vibration kind of brought this out. Because if it takes something 35 milliseconds to tear, and the only way to contract a muscle faster than that is in this incredibly fast, response, then what are we doing squatting and clamshells and anything that we would start to look at that would be preventative? I think the answer is not in completely obliterating these opportunities, but to have as much connective tissue as possible to stave off the stimulus, not the speed. You can't change the speed. But if the ACL is like this, instead of like this, it's going to take more load. And that's where training can get us. I think that's very, very important. So if we can do M2 and M3 responses, which is really the training process, then maybe something that is not so bad, maybe is that instead of being something really, really bad. Or maybe it can be nothing instead of a little bit. But using, and this is again going back to like, man, this is so interesting when information reveals itself. I think that's where the value, what we were doing back originally when Spark got rebooted at Nike, and now what the Nike SSP is now Synaptic, using the strobes, which are incredibly expensive piece of equipment and may be worth it. It's just hard to buy like that many strobes when you have a team sport where the lights are blinking, and how that has this amazingly positive impact on skill mastery. Instead of throwing bad passes, or in addition to throwing bad passes, how about we set the goggles to disrupt vision, even though you're getting a perfect pass, so you constrain something else while you maintain an affordance of a good pass, a good spin to put the ball at the basket. But I think some of these unique sensory system interventions might be able to get us a little bit closer, not to the spinal reflex, but something much faster. And that is a very interesting thing, where even if you just did your training with the goggles on, you did training with other types of sensory input, maybe your different auditory stimulus or disruptions. All of these things, like if I was yelling at you, or if the crowd noise was too loud, or if it was psychological warfare where you're hearing death metal, for 28 hours straight, that would significantly affect your decision making. And the decision making is part of the motor skill process, and the motor skill process might be what allows you to be faster at activating muscle, even though you can't possibly get into the M1 response 30 to 50 milliseconds. This is stuff that's really interesting to think about, but it might explain why there's some result with certain things, but we don't necessarily think of why, other than it being like a really cool thing, because training with strobes looks really cool and it can be a lot of fun. And maybe blocking out one, going opaque on one lens allows you to create a different view of depth perception on the incoming ball or the ball on a tee. All of these things are really, really things that make sense to me to try, particularly at a very, very high level where you're nailing your precision, but now you're trying to improve mastery, and mastery of movement, and mastery of open loop, unpredictable environments, ecosystems that those people love to use that terminology, can very well be the difference between an ACL that stays intact and one that blows out.